I'm very fortunate. I don't need to be here. Like I don't need to do work. Like I mean, I could just sit at home and watch paint dry, and just watch Netflix and just like bathe in coconut oil. I don't know what I would do. I could do that, but so yes, like I can. And at the time that I wrote the 4-Hour Work Week, little known fact, one of the original titles was the 2-Hour Work Week because that's how much time I was spending running my business at the time. But the publisher was like, no, 2-Hour Work Week, come on, that's ridiculous. And I was like, 4-Hour Work Week? And they're like, okay, now we're talking. Hey, man.
Hello again.
Yeah. Oh,
Exactly.
thank you. Hello, everybody. Lange nicht gesehen. Not so long.
That's for now.
A little energy break, and here we are.
He is very good in German.
Thank you. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
19 years since I last spoke any German, but I do love Germany. Happy to be here.
We're doing it in English, I would say.
Thank God for that.
I told you behind the stage that you and your podcasts are the reason that I started my own podcast 7.5 years ago, and now I can call myself a podcaster, which is because you painted the way many of us followed, and so thank you very much for everything.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, it's been a hell of a journey, and I was inspired also by other podcasters.
Why did you start the podcast?
Well, I started the podcast, I suppose, in simple terms because I completely burned out on my third book. So The 4-Hour Chef was a 3-year project that I did in a year and maybe 2 months. So it was a very compressed deadline, and I effectively just fell apart at the end of that project. But in the process of launching it, for every launch, I ask a few questions of my friends and peers and network. One of them is, what is the uncrowded channel? Is there an uncrowded, undervalued channel? And typically I would interview best-selling authors and ask them, what did you do that seemed like a waste of time? Meaning you expected it to do a lot and it did very little. What did you expect to do very little that actually did a lot in terms of book sales? And the answer for that particular period was podcast. Podcasts were the undervalued channel. This was in 2012, November 2012. And so I ended up going on Joe Rogan's show, Nerdist, Mark Maron, a whole list of these shows. And the fact that I could have a casual but also nuanced long-form conversation was so refreshing when compared to the usual 2, 3, 4 minutes on television where they would mispronounce my name, they're reading something over my shoulder from a teleprompter, and it's very rushed. So I decided then afterwards, in my recovery from the implosion of my physical health related to this book, that I would try podcasting as an experiment, just to do 6 to 10 episodes. I set the expectation with my audience, which I did through the blog. It's easy to forget the blog, but the blog was the connective tissue pre-social media that allowed me to communicate with my fans directly, which authors typically can't do. And treated it as a way to get better at asking questions, and I knew that would help me in my future books, even if the podcast failed. And so when I'm choosing projects, I'm typically looking for something that will help me develop skills or deepen skills, develop or deepen relationships so that even if they fail by external metrics, I win long term just by virtue of these things snowballing. And that was the beginning of the podcast. I went back and listened to the first 2 episodes recently. It was pretty wild. 10 years.
How was it for you to listen to that?
The first one was pretty embarrassing because I interviewed Kevin Rose,
A friend of yours.
and we had way too much to drink on that first episode. I treated it a little bit too much like a conversation over drinks with Kevin, which I think you can do in part, and it was the right thing for me to do at the time. Right? I look back now and I cringe a little bit, but the key for me, the through line, and the reason I think I've been able to do the podcast for 10 years is that I always try to keep it fun for me. If I don't do that, there is not going to be any longevity. So I'm constantly tweaking and changing things in order to keep it energy positive for me. And part of that was just getting sloppy and drunk on the first episode. That's fine. Who cares? And then the second episode, I was like, no alcohol. Josh Waitzkin, take this seriously. And that one actually holds up really, really well. I was very happy with it. Josh is amazing also, but you can learn a lot, or I was able to go back and learn a lot of lessons in retrospect looking at those first 2 episodes. Because, for instance, the second episode, at the time I was using Skype to record, I had a corded headset that was not very high quality. Josh didn't even have a headset. We were recording off of the laptop audio, and it didn't matter. It really didn't matter. It was still very coherent, really detailed, really tactical, and I think it's easy to get wrapped up in the tools and the polish and the fancy, but man, good stories, good tactics go a long way, and I'm just happy to be able to do one of the most relaxing and rewarding jobs imaginable.
To call it a job is amazing, right?
Oh, it's amazing. And I'll just, since I've had too much caffeine, I'll keep going here and you can stop me. But
No, just relax.
yeah, I know. Let me just loosen up my shoulders. Whenever the podcast started to really feel like a job, in the sense that I was dragging my feet or I started to not look forward to conversations, I would change something. So for instance, in podcasting, as in many things, there are certain economics at work. And if you look at some of the more popular podcasts out there, they do very high volume. They're doing 3 episodes a week, 4 episodes a week, 5 episodes a week. There are editorial reasons for that, but there are also business reasons for that. Right? You have more advertising slots, you have more annual revenue, et cetera. And in my case, I bumped up my frequency from around 4 episodes a month, so once a week, to 6. And I noticed after 2 months or so that I was starting to drag my feet a little. It was too much volume for me to actually digest the conversations and put things into practice for myself. And it started to really eat at me. And I made the decision then to ratchet back. So on average, we still do, I would say, 4 to 5 episodes a month, but as soon as it started feeling like a job, I started playing with the dials to return back to that energy positive instead of that energy negative, which seems like an artistic decision, and it is, but it's an energetic decision. If you're playing the long game, if you want to play the long game, which I would encourage people to think in those terms, then it's not time. It's not attention, although attention is more important than time in some respects. It's really fundamentally that core level of energy that determines everything else. So those are a few of the ways that I've thought about this stuff.
When did you realize, you said that you did an experiment in the beginning, 6 episodes, but now you know it worked. When did you realize, oh, this is the thing, I want to keep this doing for 10 years now?
I never made the 10-year plan. I don't even make 5-year plans professionally. I don't even have a 3-year plan professionally. I really plan out about 12 months or 6 months. And in this particular case, especially after I did an episode with Ed Catmull, who at the time I believe was president of Pixar.
Pixar, yeah.
That was the first interview I conducted with someone I'd never had any contact with. And I was so nervous. If you go back and listen to it, I go, like 1,000 times. It's so bad. It drove people nuts. But in between that verbal tick, it held together pretty well, and people responded well to it. And I said, okay, this really expands things outside of my friend group, outside of my acquaintance group. And the sky is kind of the limit in terms of who I can reach out to at this point. And I also saw that I was getting better at asking questions, getting better at fixing these verbal tics, getting better at architecting the conversations. And I actually hired researchers who had worked at this television show called Inside the Actors Studio, which in the US is very famous. They interviewed every celebrity you can imagine in terms of entertainers and actors and so on, became this institution. And I hired one of the chief researchers from that show to review my transcripts and to tell me where I missed opportunities, what I could have done differently, what I could have done better. And so he would go through and he would redline my transcripts. So I saw a path to tremendous learning over the next handful of months. I would do it for the next handful of months, and then I would reassess. And if I didn't like something, I would change something. But I never had a super long-term plan, and that's been very freeing in a sense, because it's given me the liberty, or I've given myself the liberty to experiment. I don't hold it too tightly.
What is it with the experiments? It seems you're really, really in love with doing experiments. Why do you love experimenting so much?
I think there are a few different ways to look at this. One is it's a semantic sleight of hand. It's a way you trick yourself into doing things that could fail. Right?
Most people are afraid of failing.
If you view something as a project, then the project generally succeeds or fails. If you view it as an experiment, then you're just getting feedback. You're testing a hypothesis. So psychologically, it's easier for me to take risks if I view it that way. Right? There is no failure or success in an experiment unless the study design is piss poor. As long as you have a properly run experiment, you're getting valuable feedback and information no matter what happens. And that is very freeing from an artistic perspective, from a business perspective. And there are a lot of things from a business perspective that I also did very differently with the podcast. And the second, I suppose, lens you could use with the experimentation is I really enjoy firsts. I really enjoy trying things for the first time. And I'm less of an engineer when it comes to tweaking variables to optimize, let's just say after you've established like a base technology or a base conclusion. Even though I think I'm associated with optimizing, I'm actually, I think, a better early stage experimenter than I am an optimizer. Like I'm generally not optimizing for the last 20%. I'm trying to figure out the fewest pieces you can move around and put in order to get the most out of the first 80%. And I mentioned Josh Waiskin earlier, who is a very close friend, and he's really the best at taking people who are world class and making them the best in the world. That's his superpower. He does it for himself as well. I think I operate in the first 80%. So that experimentation pervades almost everything that I do. It's also a way to test your own assumptions. And we all run our lives based on these invisible scripts that are governed by beliefs, assumptions that we have. Usually we didn't conclude these on our own. Usually these are borrowed from parents, from our society, from our peer group. And it's helpful to poke at those. And another way to frame that is experimentation.
And now you're doing the podcast for 10 years. I think this is the longest thing you ever done something, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
What?
I'm a novelty seeker. So doing something, it's a bit of a head fake though, I could say. But I don't want to interrupt your question.
No, what I'm interested is how did you change over the past 10 years and how has the podcast contributed to that change now that you do something for so long time and not just a short time like an experiment?
So there were a few upfront decisions that were made that allowed me tremendous flexibility in how I approach the podcast.
Okay.
So for instance, there are some very, very popular, very successful podcasts that are very, I would say, closely defined, right? So you might have a show like Acquired, which I think is quite a strong show. You might have a show like, you name it. There are dozens of them. A true crime podcast that's very successful, true crime. And those are pretty tight parameters on what you can or can't do. Now, I know it seems narcissistic, it probably is, to call something the Tim Ferriss Show, but what that allows me to do is pretty much whatever the hell I want to do. And what that means, to answer your question about how I've changed and how the podcast has informed that, is it's allowed me to follow my ever-changing interests, to address my changing goals, dreams, fears, insecurities, problems, challenges. Those could be related to anything imaginable. And I think people who've listened to the podcast for a long time have seen these chapters where, for a period of time, I was very engaged with the startup ecosystem, and I still am. And then I bleeded into science and early stage science, especially as related to mental health therapeutics and trying to address conditions like treatment-resistant depression and chronic anxiety, PTSD. And that has been a chapter for, let's just call it the last 5 years especially, but I'd say 10 years. And through all of that, I've been able to seek out the people I would want to ask for advice. So every good podcast episode that I've done is deeply personal. It's coming from someplace inside of me with a wellspring of curiosity, which could come from desperation, right? It's like when I was with my ex-girlfriend and we were having a lot of trouble and we were just repeating the same conversations and having the same fights, and I was just like, fuck. This is so bad. How are we going to fix this? Well, I'm going to call up Sue Johnson and find these famous people who work with couples and just selfishly have them on the podcast to ask them for advice.
But now it's your ex-girlfriend.
Yeah, there's that. Not all good things must come to an end sometimes, But so yeah, it didn't quite work in terms of fixing things, but you can take. I think the personal are the most universal. When you try to write something for everyone, for your audience, when you try to make a video for as large an audience as possible, I think you depersonalize things to the extent that oftentimes a lot of people might kind of like it, but in my experience, if you simply have a proven test market of one, if you know you have an audience of one, in other words, yourself, it's going to resonate with people most strongly. And my assumption with the podcast editorially is that almost no one's going to listen to every episode, but I would like, say, 1 out of every 10 episodes to deeply impact 10% of my audience. I don't need them or even necessarily want them to listen to every episode, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but I would rather have 10% of my audience love every episode than 50 or 70% kind of like every episode. I would much rather have the high-intensity emotional response. I think that's how you build your 1,000 true fans. That's how you build the die-hard fans.
You said in a recent interview that you are a competitive guy, but it seems in podcasting that you're not. You're not into a rush for higher numbers. You didn't go into the video thing. You more or less stayed at your kitchen table, like in the beginning, and do your thing. Why do you keep the competitive Tim out of the podcast studio?
Well, I do. So this is a very good question, and I would say that there are ways in which I'm competitive, but I feel like you need to be very careful about where you compete, because if you are competitive by nature, and I would say that I'm very, very competitive by nature, you can be pulled into games that you shouldn't be playing in the first place. For instance, games, at least games in business, tend to be tied to numbers. Okay, so if there's a metric, YouTube views, subscribers, how you rank on Spotify as a platform, whatever the number might be, you want to make sure that you are explicitly choosing the right games, not letting the metrics or groupthink determine which games you should play, if that makes any sense. So whenever I find myself or my team being pulled into something because 4 or 5 other well-known podcasters or YouTubers are doing it, I almost always hit the brakes and I ask a lot of questions. And I'd say there are a few drivers behind that. One is that I really believe, personally, it's most gratifying to be the only, not the best. And one way to think of that is creating your own category. Like, can you create your own category? And there's a book called 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. If you get it, get the oldest version. And there's a chapter called The Law of Category, and it talks about various things, light beer and so on, but the approach of creating or tackling a blue ocean as opposed to a Red Sea by creating a new category. I am constantly thinking in terms of redefining a category or creating a new category. And if you do that, at least cognitively in the mind share of your audience, you are not competing with anyone. You are the one and only X, whatever that X is. And that's why also I play around with the format so much. right? So I did heresies, drunk dialing, which I should probably do more of. It's pretty fun.
It was pretty fun. Yeah.
Yeah, drunk dialing is where I basically have people fill out a Google form and I call listeners and, and talk to them while I'm drinking tequila or something like that. I'd say the quality of my answers probably deteriorates pretty substantially after 45 minutes.
But it's honest that
It's fun. It's fun. And I do these things because you never know which format is going to click. And
So still experimenting within the format.
absolutely. And I'm going to be doing all sorts of experiments in the next few months also. Yeah, as soon as you stop experimenting, I feel like you are either in an incremental game of marginal improvement, which I don't find very fun, but there's a lot of value in that if you have like a really good COO or director of marketing or paid acquisition who can really play with all those dials, but it's not my sweet spot. Or if you're not experimenting in pretty outrageous ways, things that seem strange, things that seem really out of left field, then you're probably getting pulled into groupthink as well. You're probably adopting the so-called best practices or kind of chasing the algorithm or doing things that are mimicking other people in the field. And I have a very small team by design, and to make use of that team in a very high leverage way, we have to do things differently. And that's not accidental, right? I'm creating the positive constraint of a small team so that we can't waste a lot of resources. It doesn't work. So there's a self-correcting mechanism. If I drift too far into what other people are doing, I get punished. And I like that. It works. I'm like an obedient little dog. Make my mind do what it wants to do. Yeah.
What are you saying to your team then? What is your category? How you name that?
I mean, my category, I'd say, I haven't thought about labeling it, to be honest, but I would say it's assumption tester. Like
Assumption tester?
Chief assumption tester. Yeah, if it's like, you all have to do this, you can't do that. You hear these all the time. When I started my blog, it was like, you have to write blog posts that are no longer than 1,000 words. It's like, what? So it's just like when people are like, you need to drink 8 cups of water a day. It's like, okay, show me the study. show me any evidence for that. You can't find it. It doesn't exist. Or you get into podcasts. When I got into podcasts in 2014, multiple people, very, very, very accomplished, smart people said, it's too late, man. Podcasts have, that ship has sailed. It is too late to start a podcast, 2014. And if you do a podcast, it has to be this short, and you have to publish every day, or you have to publish every week, and these 2 set times, and it has to be, and I'm like, where are all these rules coming from? Who made these up with great confidence now that everybody believes this is some type of scripture? So I apply this to the physical body, to business, to learning, to anything I can, because most of the beliefs we have are opinions. They are not in any way defensible fact, which should be very exciting. Like, you can push and prod and screw around in so many different ways. Like you mentioned not doing video. I was like, okay, what might this look like if this were easy, right? This is a question I like to ask. What might this look like if this were easy? I ask this all the time. And or like, how can I make this more fun? It sounds so silly, but in business, it's easy to get pulled to the metrics and the annual recurring revenue and this and this. It's like, no. Okay, if I were optimizing for fun and for health, what would I do? I wouldn't do any video. I would have a headset on, super high quality. I would go for a walk, and I would record my podcast as I'm walking. That's what I would do. So I did. And I did that with Seth Godin. I did that with Greg McKeown, these walk-and talks. And people loved them. I also said, I was like, get off your asses. You're all going blind because you're looking at a screen that's 18 inches from your face 8 hours a day. Listen to the podcast while you are walking. And people responded really well to it. I was like, okay, this isn't an automatic failure. This is something that actually people want to be along. They want to be on the ride along with me experimenting. So I'd say chief assumption tester, which anybody can do. Anybody can do here. Just make a list of your 20 business beliefs and then see what the opposite would look like and then try one of them.
I think it's a great title, a great job title. Philip had in a keynote this morning about the state of German internet. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what you think about the state of podcasting right now. You said 10 years ago people told you, oh, you shouldn't start a podcast.
The
What do you
state of
think?
podcasting. I think podcasting is very saturated. It's going to get more saturated. A lot of podcast networks are going to fail in the next,
Why do you
say,
think
2
that?
years. Because the easiest way to increase the total number of impressions you can provide to advertisers is by producing huge numbers of new shows. It's very hard to make individual shows blockbuster successes. So a lot of the networks, instead of focusing on developing hit shows, they just make another 10 shows, and then another 20 shows, and another 30 shows, and then they sell that total number of impressions to a creative agency or someone else who's representing the buy side of the advertising equation. And to service those 20 shows, 30 shows, a lot of these companies have overhired, and they've built out massive studios and production facilities. I've walked through these places. They are huge. And I would anticipate, and I think this will be true broadly speaking, we're going to see a lot of layoffs and a lot of companies shut down in the next 2 quarters, at least in the US, because the fundraising that was done, say 1 or 2 years ago, is going to end at a zero. And then they will not be able to raise more money unless they recapitalize or do a huge down round. And at that point, I think a lot of the founders are going to do the back of the napkin math and say, okay, if we raise more money, my percentage ownership, I'm making this up, it's going to go from like 8% to 1%. And then my possible payout is X, not worth it, and they're going to shut down the company. That's my expectation. So I think there are going to be a lot of fatalities in podcasting, which is a good thing. It's not bad that it's saturated. This happens in any type of industry that has any type of meteoric growth. Right? You have this massive Cambrian explosion of dozens or hundreds or thousands, in the case of podcasts, millions of podcasts, and then the strongest survive. It's just natural selection. We see it over and over again. There's consolidation. This company buys that company, which buys this company. It's like the big fish eating this fish, eating this fish. We're going to see all of that kind of consolidation. And the podcasts that are going to be the most resilient, I would say, are those that people think of as almost a standalone category. They're just such strong representations of almost an archetype of a particular type of podcast that their brand toehold in the minds of their audience is so strong that they have also, this is one of the benefits of having that kind of 10% of my audience loves or hates every episode. That strength of affinity is kind of like magnetism, right? If you have a lukewarm kind of milquetoast podcast that puts out a lot of episodes, has a really good sales force or sales representative for selling ads, but the affinity is very casual listening for someone, you could be replaced easily, a lot of those shows are going to die. And
So there's room for podcasts, but you should make your own podcast, not...
Yeah, there's room for podcasts. I mean, I would give the same advice for podcasts that I would give for books. When people ask me about writing books, I'm like, you should only write a book if you're going to be really happy that you did it, even if you make zero money from it. It's very challenging. There are better economic models. The CPMs, right, the actual advertising dollars per 1,000 downloads is going to get pressed down. I'm already seeing this, have seen this for the last year and a half for podcasting. And I suppose, kind of advertising deafness has increased, which we see everywhere. You can read an article by Andrew Chen called The Law of Shitty Click-Throughs, I think it is. And he talks about the fact that in the beginning you have banner ads, everybody's clicking on banner ads. And then after 5 or 10 years, almost no one clicks on banner ads. Similar with podcasting, in the beginning, the ads were very, very effective. That has become more challenging. And as there are more podcasts, people are willing to sell at lower and lower rates. So there's a lot at play. And this is all to say, if you want to make a lot of money, I don't think podcasting or books are your first options. But if those are your means of creative expression, if those are, for me, as an example, a means of personal growth and having amazing conversations, or maybe your magic is in post-production, like This American Life, for instance, and Ira Glass and so on, they are amazing at doing the interviews, but they're even more amazing at crafting and editing the audio. into this beautiful piece of work, then do it for sure. But if you're doing it because podcasting seems hot and you want to make a lot of money, I would advise against it.
Speaking of money,
Yes, exactly.
My keyword.
this is your keyword.
It's
I
my
told you
keyword.
before.
Yeah.
I mean, we both do podcasts. I mean, and I'm the money guy, and he's the depth and wellness and soul guy.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do my job.
Let's do it.
I mean, you're an investor, you're an author, keynote speaker. Is podcasting, or has podcasting been overall your greatest source of wealth?
No, investing.
Investing.
Yeah, and then podcasting would be certainly high up there just in terms of cash flow. It helps to, it's the financial engine that allows me to do a lot with my foundation, SciSay Foundation, and the early stage science, paying the employees. All of that comes, most of that comes from the podcast. And then I would say the books are, I mean, look, the books are still very successful, but the economics of publishing are very, very difficult. You could talk to any musician or book author. So I would say overall, from a cash flow perspective, the podcast is what generates the most to keep all the other departments running at this point. But there are multiple sources of income. The investing, especially early stage, what I do, early stage investing, is very lumpy. Most of them go to zero. The really big successes, in my experience, generally take 7 to 12 years. You can't ask your employees to forego salaries for 7 to 12 years, in my experience. So you need something more reliable, and that's what the podcast provides.
How many people work for the Tim Ferriss enterprise?
I have 3 employees.
3, okay. And investments, I mean, you said that there's, I mean, we saw them when you came in, some big names. Which one were best for you?
The best outcomes so far have been Uber, because I was one of the first 3 advisors before they raised money. Shopify, I was the first advisor when they had 8 or 12 employees. Duolingo is one of the first investors there. Also very early in cryptocurrency, so that has been one of the larger outcomes. You have to be careful with that though, kids. Don't try it at home. Do not use your retirement money to buy crypto.
So you're not a crypto believer anymore?
I mean, believer, I'm very careful with believing. I think that I shouldn't have any strong opinions. I really feel like if it were driven by technology and certain basic fundamentals, then you should talk to the computer scientists who actually read the white papers and understand the deeper, finer technical aspects. But a lot of it is driven by markets. And when you have markets, you're dealing with large numbers of people, you're dealing with media cycles. So I still hold quite a bit of crypto, but if someone were asking me how they should build wealth, unless they're deeply technical and have a very, very high tolerance for extreme volatility, I wouldn't recommend they go into crypto.
What would you recommend? I mean, all of us want to get a little wealthier. What's the best path these days? What would you do? Like, what would a young Tim Ferriss do today to get the old Tim Ferriss, or the older Tim Ferriss?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably do a lot of what we've been talking about, in the sense that if you want to get really wealthy, I think you need to think of how to be a category of one. And so when I was investing, as an example, how was I a category of one? Well, I had unique access because of the first book, The 4-Hour Workweek. I had built this large platform in the blog at that point. My blog was one of the largest in the world. I was very good, I think I'm still pretty good, at marketing, PR, launches, things like that, very tactical. So I could get into deals because of my geographic location. I moved to San Francisco. Because of the network I built from the first book, I could also make introductions. And then I could help quite a lot with actual product design and launching. So, for instance, collaborating with Shopify to create the first Build a Business competition. So my brand, so to speak, was early stage investor, super highly value add with a platform. At the time, that was pre-social media, let's just call it. that was a very, very unique kind of trifecta. Of
What is that
qualities.
today? I mean, like how? I mean, that doesn't transport easily into today.
There's nothing that I can tell this audience that everyone's going to be able to do. So the exercise is, what is easier for you than it is for other people, right? This is an endurance question, right? So what do you find easier? You could ask your friends this too. What do you see me doing, or what am I able to do more easily than other people? Okay, that's one question. Another question is, where do you derive more energy? Like, what are the things that you could do all day and still have energy left over? You have special batteries, so it might not be a good question for you. I've seen you on stage. You have very special batteries. But what can you do all day and still have effectively a surplus of energy? And then I would say focusing on the skill development and the relationship development. So where do you have any unique capability of doing that? In terms of where people should go, like TikTok, Instagram, this, that, and the other thing, all of these are kind of like crayons and markers and pens. Like, you have to know how to draw first, and for me, those principles are, from a business perspective, if you're not technical, positioning. So I mentioned Al Ries and Trout. They wrote 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. Positioning, Blue Ocean Strategy. These are the principles that kind of transcend the tactics or the technologies of the day. Those are the places where I would spend time. In terms of building wealth, the tools are always going to change. So it might be a disappointing answer, but the fact of the matter is, if you want to get extraordinarily wealthy, it's pretty uncommon to do that. So the harder questions you ask yourself, the more you, in my opinion, don't rush in picking your target. Like, pick your target very carefully. I think a lot of folks chase particular targets, and they put a lot of effort into the chase, but they've chosen the wrong target. Like, if you're running into something that 100 other people can do equally well, or 1,000, or 10,000, or 1,000,000, it's very unlikely that you're going to make, let's make up some numbers, $50 million, $100 million or more. It's very, very unlikely. So probably a dissatisfying answer, but that's...
No, I mean, it's an honest answer.
I don't want to bullshit you guys and be like, go do Vine, everybody. Go focus on Vine. Remember how that turned out? Like, TikTok, people are going to have empires destroyed.
But then let me rephrase it a little bit. I mean, looking at your success, how much would you attribute to your content and your ability to be an outstanding storyteller and content producer, and how much would you attribute to distribution and marketing savviness? Is that 50-50, or was it?
Yeah, I understand the question. I would say there's a lot of luck and timing involved. I don't want to discount that, but when people get on stage and they're like, everything has been so lucky, there's an aspect of truth, but I would say that one of the keys to my podcast success in getting involved with podcasts when I got involved with podcasts. I'm very good at finding, I would say, small-scale proven technologies, small-scale proven fill in the blank that are on the verge of going mainstream. That's what I did with e-commerce, with my various investments. That's what I did with the gig economy, with a bunch of my investments. I was like, these seem kind of inevitable to me, so let me try to paddle for the wave now because I think the timing is good. So I would say there's an aspect of choosing the right lane and the right converging of trends if you want to play that game. The content for me, I hate that word, but like my book, let's take the first book. I put everything imaginable into that book. And that is the reason the book stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 or 5 years, unbroken every week, was, I think, because of the effort I put into making the product as strong as possible. Because the product becomes the marketing in a lot of cases. It certainly is true with books. I think that's true with podcasts because there's a huge discoverability problem with podcasts. And YouTube partially solves that, which is why a lot of the people have gone to YouTube. It's a growth mechanism because of that discoverability. But I really feel like there's always a market and a word of mouth phenomenon if your product is good enough. And that might sound naive, but that is necessary but not sufficient. And that's true of the marketing and distribution. I do think I'm good at distribution, and I'm good at marketing. But time and time again, I've seen with podcast episodes, there are some that I've put a ton of time into and I've pushed the hell out of them, but they weren't as strong, and I could talk about what makes a strong episode, as something else, and that stronger episode wins out. So I may be too old school, but I really feel like, especially as you guys have been talking about this a lot at this conference, like AI, deepfakes, all this stuff. Once the saturation of the informational onslaught, like 10x's in the next 12 months, which I think is easily going to be the case, the signal is going to be really, really high quality because the platforms exist to monetize through allowing advertisers to reach their users by and large. And in that case, like the means of distribution, you're going to have to be very, very clever with your launches and PR. All of the paid acquisition stuff is going to be oversaturated. So I'm optimistic. I think if you put out something that's really heartfelt, really personal, at least in my genre, and very high quality, you understand storytelling, you study it, and you make it practical, at least in nonfiction how-to, I think it rises to the surface. I think it really does. That's my best stab.
Guys at the bar, Philip, Michael, anybody? Questions? Oh, Bettina was first.
Hi. Thank you so much. I really love how you talk about the spectrum between short-term and long-term and experimentation. And within that, you talk about challenging convention. And everyone that's been on stage here in the last days is all convention challenges, but you just can iterate a bit faster, I think. So how do you handle your backlog of ideas of conventions to challenge?
Yeah, that's a good one. I have like 1,000+ notes on my phone, and then a few thousand more notes in Evernote and other places. So I would say the way that I contend with that is by routinely doing an 80-20 analysis to determine, at least on the business side, what the main drivers are. Like, what are the main variables that we're considering playing with or experimenting with? That could be cadence. It could be making, as a result of choosing cadence, making the production faster and easier and more enjoyable for me. But there are a million things I would love to test that I suspect I'm never going to get around to. But right now, as a forcing function, right, I'm working on my first book project in 6 years, and I'm hoping it'll come out by the end of this year. We'll see. But most of the assumption testing that I'm doing right now on my personal level, outside of fitness and all that stuff, is related to book publishing and thinking about what I can productively break in book publishing. The things they say that nobody can do, that no one should do, I'm like, okay, what's a really cheap way for me to test that now with social media, the newsletter, or the podcast, so that we can dip our toe in the water to see if there might be a there for something that's higher stakes for me, which would be a major book project. I very, very infrequently test anything for the first time with something that has high consequence. I'm constantly using my audience and platforms to test things, and then I make it a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. A lot of it's invisible, unless people are very good detectives, and then it comes out later.
Another question? Philip?
Yeah. Hi, Tim. My question is, how do you become such a good learner and such a good teacher?
Well, thanks for that. I think they go together. I would say you can become a really good learner by forcing yourself to teach other people. And if it's confusing, they don't get it. That's a teacher problem, not a student problem. So workshopping as a teacher, I think, is a great way to become a better learner. And then I would say also I have different frameworks for learning, and there are many different ways to approach this, but people can look this up online, just so I don't spend too much time on this, but there's a DISSS protocol, a framework, I suppose, that I use, which is like deconstruction, and then you skip the I, that's just to hold the word together. Then there's selection, which is 80-20 analysis, sequencing, which is putting them in the right order, and then stakes, which is creating consequences or incentives so that you do the thing you're saying you want to do. This applies to losing weight, this applies to learning a new language, this applies to launching a podcast, you can apply it to all of these things. So I do have a methodology for approaching learning, And the more reps you put in, the more times you repeat that, the better and more natural that becomes. So I would say that those are two approaches. I also study outliers. So if there's someone who's, for instance, very good at ultramarathons who shouldn't be, right? They're built like a bodybuilder, or maybe they're really overweight. They just should not be good at ultramarathons, but they are good at ultramarathons. Then I'll study that because they're typically capitalizing on some type of learned or set of learned skills because they can't depend on attributes, right? I'm not going to ask Michael Phelps how I grow my feet and lats to be like Michael Phelps because he's born that way. I'm not going to be able to replicate that. So I like studying the outliers, people who learn a lot of languages later in life would be another example, to try to tease out the approaches that they use. And then I'll test them. I'll test them in different ways.
Last question before we have to go. I could go on for a lot longer, but I want to ask one question. I think it's to me, it's the obvious question with you. I mean, you enjoyed major success with the 4-Hour Workweek, the book 4-Hour Workweek, and I know a lot of people that were influenced by you and that try to change their lives into 4-Hour Workweek lives. Do you do that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I can, look, this is the question, this is a common question. I'm very fortunate. I don't need to be here. Like, I don't need to do work. Like, I mean, I could just sit at home and watch paint dry and just watch Netflix and it's like bathe in coconut oil. I don't know what I would do. I could do that, but so yes, like I can. And at the time that I wrote the 4-Hour Workweek, little known fact, one of the original titles was the 2-Hour Workweek because that's how much time I was spending running my business at the time. But the publisher was like, no, 2-Hour Workweek, come on, that's ridiculous. And I was like, 4-Hour Workweek? And they're like, okay, now we're talking. So I do walk the walk. You know, I routinely every month take, every year I take about a month, I would say, off of all devices. I can do those things. But I also like creating. Like, we're all gonna ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We're not here very long. So I feel like I do the things that give me the most energy. And if that's coming to a place like Hamburg, which I've always wanted to visit, and having conversations like this, getting questions that I haven't seen in advance, like, this is fun for me. This is kind of improv jazz. So I can walk the walk, but I also love creating and doing. But if the podcast ends up being negative for me energetically, I'll stop the podcast. And I'll find another way to pay my employees. I'll figure it out. So I do walk the walk, and I think almost anybody in this audience, we're kind of like working dogs. Right? Like, we're kind of like border collies. So if like somebody has a border collie in New York City and it sits in the apartment, it's eating the couch, it's like, what's wrong with the border collie? It's like, there's nothing wrong with the border collie. Like, border collies need to run. And I think a lot of people in this room, just like me, like to run. So I also enjoy working, creative challenge myself and really pushing at these boundaries. And I enjoy watching people do the same thing.
Thank you so much for doing this, Tim. Thank you for border collieing to us doing this.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks, man.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Very easy.
Thank you so much.